Part 2, the BFG. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each strode he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it on one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being beaten against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightened thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. The cave. The giant ran on, and now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. She made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong she had to duck down again with the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on like that for hours. Then all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down, and Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to take a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leapt over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest and then down into a valley and up and over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rocks were scattered around, and the dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great, craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud. Over to one side, the rim of the morning sun was coming up, blood as red. Red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of a mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the dark hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stepped and turned and rolled the great black stone into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground, and then the giant let go the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He is getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He will probably eat me raw just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon in some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a great rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves stood rows upon rows of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corner. They took up every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty, old leather vest that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded and green and were far too short in the leg. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toe stuck out. Sophie crouched on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind. A finger of ice was running up and down along the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled through the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he's really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inward and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive, square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is giant, you think I is man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibals and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere. Out there, us has the name famous of bone-crushing giant. Bone-crushing giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones get crackety-crack for miles around. Ouch!" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant like to gobble human beings from turkey." The giant said, "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English? Bone-crushing giant says Turks is tasting ever more juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamoury flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "Well, I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly indifferent. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious, some is yucky slush. Greeks is all full of yucky slush. No giants is greeting Greeks ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece is tasting all greasy," said the giant. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talk was about. Eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this particular giant and smile at all of his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama taste very strong of hats." "Why hats?" Sophie said. "You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundungle." "Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human bean, the giant said. The human bean has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human bean, he went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There's something very fishy about Wales. You mean whales, Sophie said. Whales is something quite different. Whales is whales, the giant said. Don't gubble funk about with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgusting woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You is once again gubble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and a stitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, they taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they are tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste like? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up, Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, but I do my best. I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington? Where's Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand, and the human being in Wellington has a specially scrumdiddlicious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant says. Of course, I should have known. Sophie had decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me! Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings! This I never! The others, yes, all the others was gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and grumbly giant. I is the only nice and grumbly giant in Giantville. I is the big, friendly giant. I is BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard.